All right. Well, let's go ahead and get started. Welcome everybody for coming. Thanks for coming. It's still cold in this room, but at least it's nice outside, as opposed to cold and rainy. What's the? Oh. So, just to kind of let you guys know where we're going, we'll have class this week and class next week. And then I'm going to be out of town on the 15th of March. So I'll send everybody an email and just remind you. And then we can come back for 2 more weeks. And then it'll be Easter Sunday, which I can't believe it's almost Easter. It's like crazy. So just so you know. So where we left off, Dave was asking where we left off. Where we left off was we talked at length about David and Solomon and how Solomon is credited in the Bible for building out the kingdom of Israel, but most scholars don't think that was really something Solomon did. He was much more of kind of getting the credit for what some of the other kings did. So, so just as a quick recap of everything we've been talking about, if you go back to 1200 BCE, 1200 years before Jesus, 3,200 years ago, over three, Israel was kind of existing in the highlands. Good morning. And but they were much more of a kind of a people group, just some tribal kind of maybe Bedouin or type tribes, or maybe just small villages. And then in around 1000, about 200 years later, the monarchy emerges. Saul is around 1000. David comes and usurps the throne from Saul. Solomon, his son, follows that. And then after Solomon dies, according to the biblical text, the nations split apart, and you have 2 kingdoms. You have a northern kingdom and a southern kingdom. Most scholars wonder whether that united kingdom was that united. It was very early. It was kind of more of a tribal, loose confederation of tribes. Good morning. Oh, you're fine. Loose confederation of tribes. And honestly, Israel, the northern kingdom, was really the big kingdom. Judah was kind of just out of the way. It was kind of the deserty part of Israel. So it may have been not quite as united as we like to think about it. Much more of a loose confederation. And then for the next about 400 years, 300 years, 400 years, Israel exists as a kind of a regional power under, an Israelite monarchy. And so there's some key things to remember. Just if you don't remember, there's so many kings and they have really long names and they're hard to pronounce. So, but the key ones that I think you should remember is King Omri. And when I say Omri, I'm actually talking about him and his sons and grandsons, that dynasty. And I think of them as Bob the Builder. Do you guys remember Bob the Builder? We can do it. Yes, we can. So Omri went and built all sorts of stuff. He built up Samaria. He built fortifications all around the northern Israel. And he's the one that when the Assyrians invaded and all these kind of legacy stories from the people who were escaping the Assyrians came down to Judah, most scholars think the Judahites kind of incorporated what Omri did and gave that credit to David and Solomon as kind of to show that they were just as good, if not better, than King Omri. And then the problem with the northern kingdom is they were prone to instability, coups. If you read through 1st and 2nd Kings, there's always a northern king who's getting assassinated by somebody else and somebody takes over. In the southern kingdom, they stayed relatively, I don't want to say completely, but relatively stable. There was always a Davidic king sitting on the throne in Jerusalem. So somebody from the line of David was the king. And the two important ones to remember is Hezekiah. We talked about him back at the beginning of the class. And Hezekiah was the one, he's the water guy, right? The Assyrians were coming to attack Jerusalem. Good morning. They were coming to attack Jerusalem, and Hezekiah built the tunnel to bring water into the city that you could still go and walk through today, and kind of survived the onslaught of the Assyrian army, and gave Judah at least some hope that they may be able to survive as a nation. And then King Josiah, and King Josiah is, he's the book guy. King Josiah is the one who reformed all of the worship. He said, okay, enough of all these people just having all these different gods. You have to come worship at the temple. Under his reign, either they wrote or they kind of published or brought out the book of Deuteronomy. So when we think about the law of Moses in the story in the Hebrew Bible, the priests come one day and say, hey, we were cleaning out the temple, and guess what we found? We found this book, and we're not doing anything that's in this book. And so most scholars think that book was put together to support all of the reforms that Josiah was doing. So those are the kind of the key Israelite kings. And they were, hey Pam, and they were doing great. Everything was hunky-dory until we started getting the rise of empire. And it's something that, watching the news this weekend, it's still today. Empires are still playing out and battling out across the world. In 732, the Assyrian army came in and destroyed the northern kingdom. We talked about that way back at the beginning of the class. And it gave the southern kingdom some hope that they had survived and that they were the ones chosen by God. But in 587, the Babylonians come in and wipe out the Judahites and take them off into exile in Babylon. So today, that's just a quick recap. See, you didn't even have to come all year, and you could have come today, and that's it. So today, what I want to do, because I want to get to, we spent plenty of time in the Old Testament. We want to shift over and talk in the coming weeks about the New Testament. But you can't really understand Jesus and Paul and what was going on in the New Testament unless you have a kind of a big picture understanding of what happened between the time of the Babylonian exile and the time when Jesus shows up on the ground. So that's what we're going to try to cover today. So we're going to do 1,000 years of history in 45 minutes. Okay, so the monarchy, just like I said before, the monarchy lasts for about 400 years, and then in 587 they get wiped out by the Babylonians. And so the northern kingdom's destroyed, the southern kingdom is destroyed. They're all sent out to exile, and in most cases, for almost every other culture, ancient culture, that would have been the end, and we would have never heard from them again, and we wouldn't be talking about, we'd be talking about something else in class on Sunday mornings. But the Israelites so the Israelites, when they went into exile, the Babylonian Empire they conquered pretty much everything in this region. The Israelites got pulled out of Palestine and out of Israel and moved back into Babylon over in this crescent. This is modern day Iraq. So just kind of a sense of where you are. And there's a lot of amazing architecture that we have about the Babylonian Empire. This is called the Ishtar Gate. It was one of the major gates and entrances into the city, and it's actually in the Berlin Museum. All these great artifacts are like everywhere except where they should be. It was all dismantled and put together in whatever the big museum is in Berlin. So just a little bit about the Babylonians. They had been fighting with Assyria for a long time, and in 605, Nebuchadnezzar, I'm sure you remember, have heard his name, he came in, defeated the remaining Assyrian armies, and he was crowned king of the new empire. And then he decided he needed to consolidate power, so he moved out into Palestine and the outer territories, made sure that all of them were conquered and exiled. And the Babylonian idea, and it's called sometimes you read and it's called the Chaldean Empire if you're doing reading on your own. It kind of goes back and forth, the Babylonians, the Chaldeans. Nebuchadnezzar was from the tribe of Chaldea, so since he was the king, it became that empire. But their idea was, when you conquer someone, you obliterate their culture, you take them out into the empire, you spread them all out, and they have to integrate in with everybody else. And that way, there's no argumentation left. No hint of nationalism or anything like that. They've all become just members of the empire. That was their overarching theme. Until 537, 520s, and the Persians start coming along. This is a mural which was actually in the Louvre. I saw that this summer when we were in Paris, which was really cool. But in 550, a king named Cyrus, have anybody heard of Cyrus? Cyrus the Great? He kind of rises up in Persia, conquers the Medes, who were the tribes that were controlling Persia at the time, and kind of restored Persian independence. Persia is Iran. And again, it was ironic that I'm sitting there yesterday putting together slides about Iran and empire. But the Persians went to war with Babylon. And in 539, Cyrus captured the city of Babylon, takes control of the entire empire. So kind of overnight, the battles are all around the city of Babylon, but overnight, the entire empire changes hands. And all of a sudden, if you're an Israelite who got exiled and you're living in Babylon, one day the Babylonians are in charge, and the next day, it's the Persians. It's like, okay. And but rather than embracing exile, the Persians had a different mindset. They kind of came in, Cyrus came in as one of the good guys. And he said, I'm here to liberate you. Your gods, whoever he was talking to, he took on their god. He said, your gods were angry because your rulers weren't doing the right thing. And I came to set things right. Your God appointed me to come in and set things right. And you can go home. You can go back to your homeland. Just live peacefully. Don't create problems, and send us all your money. And you can go do your thing. So the exile, that's great news to an exiled people. The reason we know this is because we have what's called the Cyrus cylinder. It's a cylinder that dates back to the time of Cyrus, and it's basically a propaganda machine. They carved these out. It's all written in Akkadian script. All these little notches in here are letters, and you can sit there and rotate the cylinder around and read the proclamations of Cyrus. And the Cyrus cylinder was discovered in 1879 by a British archaeologist who was born in Syria, but a British citizen. And his name was Hormuz Rassam, and he did a lot of excavations all through Babylonian and Mesopotamia. So he finds this cylinder, and in this cylinder that I just showed you, it's basically Cyrus saying to the Babylonians, your god Marduk, who was the Babylonian god, was really ticked off because the Babylonian kings were not doing what they were supposed to do. They weren't ruling properly. They weren't worshiping properly. So Marduk came to me and said, you need to set things right. And so I came in peace to liberate Babylon and to put things back together. Now, make no mistake that the Persians, even though they kind of said, hey, we're your buddies, we're here, they had one of the most ferocious and violent armies known to history at that time. So it was a pretty good ploy. Come in, and it was like, we're here to be your friend, send us your money, but you know what happens if you don't. You saw what happened to Babylon when they resisted. The interesting thing about the Cyrus cylinder is that when it was discovered and translated, it matched almost identically in theme and message, and even some cases whole sentences, to what is in the book of Isaiah. So Isaiah is a really complicated prophetic book. The first 40 chapters are all pre-exilic. They were written before the exile, the Babylonian exile. But chapters 40 to 55 were all written after the exile. And if you go through and read 40 through 55 and cross-reference it with what is in the Cyrus cylinder, it's not identical language, but it is like, this is almost the same kind of thing. In fact, the Israelites love Cyrus so much that in Isaiah 45 is this verse, thus says Yahweh to his anointed, his Mashiach, or Messiah, right? So they're calling, the prophet is calling Cyrus, the Persian king, the Messiah, the one who comes to rule over Israel, anointed by God. That was held prior to this strictly for Jewish kings in the line of David, but they're willing to give that authority to Cyrus as well. Whose right hand, and this is Yahweh speaking through the prophet, whose right hand I have grasped to subdue the nations before him and to strip the kings of their thrones, which is exactly what it said in the Cyrus cylinder. So you get a lot of this Persian propaganda that makes its way into the Hebrew Bible, which is pretty shocking. When I first found out about that, I was like, that's incredible. What an amazing thing. And it just kind of drives home the whole point of the fact that the Bible is a book that developed over time, and it has influences from a lot of different places. The other thing that's really interesting that has happened in here that you might miss in a casual reading of Isaiah, which I don't know if there is such thing as a casual reading of Isaiah, because I've read Isaiah and it's really hard to understand. But it's the first time when you kind of arrange the books chronologically when they were written, this Persian period is the first time that people start actually talking about Yahweh in a monotheistic term. Beforehand, if you remember from earlier classes, Yahweh was always the God that the Israelites were supposed to worship because he was their God, and these other gods were for the other people to worship. So it wasn't that Yahweh was the only God, it's that he was just the Israelite God. So don't worship the Egyptian gods, don't worship the Canaanite gods, don't worship the Babylonian gods. Those gods are for them. Yahweh is for you. But in Isaiah 40 through 55, you start getting, there is no other God except for Yahweh. You start really picking up this idea of monotheism. Scholars don't know exactly where that came from, but it certainly happened at some point either during or right after the Babylonian exile and the return to Israel by the Persians. It certainly doesn't seem to be a Babylonian idea, maybe a Persian idea, maybe a Zoroastrianism kind of monotheistic idea. I don't know. But that's where we see, if you look for that point in time where there's a shift in the Bible to there is only one God, it's here in the Persian period. Does that make sense? Any questions?
So does Genesis also deal with kind of one God?
It can be read that way, but in Genesis, so if you read in the Genesis story of the Genesis 1, the creation of the world, which was written during this Persian period, it has a monotheistic bent to it. But when you get into later stories in Genesis, like Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, you start getting this, not polytheistic, but it's called monolatry. There's a bunch of gods in the world, in the universe, and they're all gods of the different peoples, and Yahweh is Israel's God. So they acknowledge other gods existing, but Yahweh is the God that if you're an Israelite, you're supposed to worship Yahweh. So yes, in the very opening passage, there's a very monotheistic, but it was written and then appended to the Genesis right at the beginning or during the time when the whole Pentateuch came together. And that was another major thing that came out of this time frame. And so you have a bunch of books of the Bible, Ezra, Nehemiah, if you want to go take a look at that, Chronicles, they all are starting to reinterpret their older history in terms of the Babylonian exile and their return during this Persian period. And it's also the time when the final editing of the first 5 books of the Bible, the Torah, were done. So you get kind of these older texts that get intermixed with some newer writings, and they string it all together. And the reason scholars think that is in Ezra and Nehemiah, there's stories of they're back in Israel, and Ezra, who's the high priest, gathers everyone from Israel, and he reads the law, reads the Torah. And that's a story that's in Ezra. And what they do, the scholars say, when the Persians let everybody go back, and this is documented in Persian records, they wanted copies of their law code. So if you're from Assyria, or if you're from some other little small country, you can go back and you can rebuild and live in your country, but we need to understand what your rules and laws are so that we can oversee your country. And for Israel, they didn't really, prior to that, have much of a written code. And so scholars think that what they did is they compiled and they took these 5 different books that they had and stitched them together into one story, one law code that tells the story of the people of Israel and then contains all the rules and laws about how to worship God. And that it was the Persians who were requiring something from them to say, this is why we need to be able to have your rules so that we can effectively make sure you're governing according to your laws. So that's why it's very difficult. When I said, when you look at the books chronologically, sometimes that's hard because bits and pieces come from different time frames. And they can tell that that opening passage in Genesis came from a later period because the Hebrew is significantly different. So in Genesis 1, the Hebrew that's being used, again, just like if you compare what we would write today versus Shakespearean or Elizabethan English, you can tell they come from different times and that there's an older version and a more current version. Same thing with Hebrew, and they can tell the difference between, if you're an expert in ancient languages, you can tell the difference between Genesis 1 and Genesis 2, which were written at 2 different times. So the Persian period is really, really important because it's where you get kind of the biblical, the Hebrew Bible starting to come together, not just being a bunch of stories or oral traditions. All of this is starting to get written down and stitched together and preserved as a canon of scripture or a canon of books. And you can see the Persians down here, they expanded the playing field, right? So before, all the empires were always kind of just in this area here, and they would battle back and forth. Egypt, Assyria, Babylonia, Israel's here, and they would just kind of fight back and forth between here and here. But the Persians, they expanded east, they expanded north, they expanded west. They were already at the gates of Greece, or at the edges of Greece. So it was quite a much more expansive empire than what we had seen to date, or what the people of the time had seen to date. So everything was great for 100 years or a couple hundred years. They all got to go back. They were living in their land. They rebuilt the temple. They wrote down the books. And they were like, life is good. The Persians are nice. We like the Persians. And then come along the Greeks and Alexander the Great. And Alexander the Great in 332 decides it's time for me to set my sights a little bigger. He'd already conquered all of Greece. And he's like, it's time for me to conquer the world. So he invades, and it's amazing. He died at the age of 32. The cause of death is kind of debated. Some say it was syphilis or some other sexual transmitted disease. Others said it was some kind of maybe malaria or some other fever that he picked up. Nonetheless, he was out in the eastern edges of the empire and died. But in 32 years, so he lived for 32 years, but his influence shaped basically the whole rest of history. We today still have things. There's things that get taught in church. There's things that get taught in or spoken about in Washington, D.C. and in how we run our countries and politics. Politics, the word politics comes from the Greek word for polis, which is city, and how you run governments. So they changed. It was a game changer for everything: philosophy, religion, politics, the whole 9 yards. So Alexander,
Scott,
yeah.
Asia Minor, modern-day Turkey, right?
Asia Minor is kind of, this whole area, Turkey, Iran, Iraq, you move from Europe here in Greece and Spain. We're down in Africa here, and then this is the kind of this, I guess I'd call it the southwest part of the Asian continent. So
like in 450 BC, Thucydides talks about the Greeks, city-states fighting the Persians, but that was defensive up in Greece.
Well, back and forth. Yeah, I would say, and I am not an expert, but I would say that as the Persian Empire expanded this way, the Greeks, it wasn't like they were not doing anything and then Alexander just popped up. So there was probably a lot of back and forth here in this area as they were fighting over, who was going to kind of control Greece. And then it was Alexander who kind of swept in and took the entire empire. Yes?
So my geography is abysmal. The eastern border of the pink there, that's a river going down there? What river is it? Like, what's the eastern, how far do the pink go?
This one actually doesn't have the rivers, and so down here you're into India. This is the Persian Gulf here today, Iran, Iraq, Egypt here, Pakistan, and up in here is probably Pakistan and Afghanistan, or Pakistan's maybe out here in Afghanistan. Actually, I'll get a map.
Geography is so bad.
Yeah, to overlay kind of the modern day countries on here. I don't have one, but I can find one and that to kind of see how far they went.
My chef was that Alexander got as far as India.
Yeah, he got to when Alexander died, he was way out here on the edge of the empire and died. So, and that was, you know, he's the one who kind of opened up as well the Indian trade, you know, to be able to the trade routes to bring. I mean, there were always trade routes bringing stuff from there, but he kind of, you know, under Greek and then Roman rule, they built the roads and the infrastructure to kind of help facilitate more of that trade coming from India through the Levant. Any other questions I can't answer? I'm sure I can. Or give you vague and deceiving.
I wonder why I don't remember geography.
Yeah. I think the thing to remember is for them, for the ancients, this was the whole world. This was the whole world, right? And you know, now we know of ancient civilizations in China. You know, down in India, there were people. Japan had, you know, has ancient civilization. There were, you know, tribes of Native Americans in North America. All sorts of stuff going on in South America and Australia. You know, we think of the world as the entire globe. But for the ancients, when they talked about the world, it was this area and a little bit of Southern Europe, right? That was their world. So, yes?
Today's news, Iran is bombing Israel, right?
They are, I think. They are shooting. So here, this is the basic outline of Iran here, and they are shooting missiles all over the place in a response. Israel is right over here.
Well, that's so.
Saudi Arabia is here. Israel's here. Turkey is up here.
And they're shooting all the way over to Israel,
Yes.
the missiles.
Yes.
Wow.
Yeah. Yeah.
Amazing.
Okay. So what Alexander did is his approach to empire, again, in all of these, they all have a dual approach. And one approach is always the same. Crushing military power, right? Do what we tell you, or else we will crush you and destroy you. The other thing is after they capture a country, or what do they do to change them, to incorporate them? The Babylonians, remember, haul everybody off and exile them and scatter them out into the winds. The Persians said, go back home and live in your home and follow your own traditions. Alexander said, you can all live where you live, you know, pay your tribute, don't cause problems. But he started the cultural revolution. He was going to Hellenize, which is the fancy word for Greekanize. I think Greekanize doesn't sound as cool as Hellenize. So they actually Hellas is the Greek word for Greece. so Hellenize means to Greekify everything. And he was like, we're just going to change the culture in the entire world, and we're going to take Greek culture and spread it everywhere, which, ironically, is exactly what America has done in the 20th century. So after World War II, a big part of our foreign policy was to spread American culture, American values, American everything as far around the world as you can go. And so that's kind of where we are today. But it started with Alexander. So he introduced the Greek language. And within 100 years of his invasion of Southeast Asia, Greek was the common language that everybody spoke. He brought in Greek philosophy and started pushing that. They brought in ideas of how governments should run, cities should run. They built gymnasiums. They started doing all of these cultural activities. And you can see Greek philosophy, if you've heard, and we'll talk about in the coming weeks, when you read the New Testament, and there's things there's things we believe as Christians that don't go back to the Bible. They go back to Greek philosophy. And it's when the early Christian leaders started merging Greek philosophy together with the Bible to be the Old Testament to kind of create a new belief system. So Greek, the impacts of Alexander are tremendous. And like I said, Greek became the language of the empire for the next 1,000 years. Even though they spoke Latin in Rome, they also spoke Greek. And as you spread out across the empire, it was Greek that was the most common language, not actually Latin. So Alexander creates this giant empire and then dies at the age of 32. Doesn't have any heirs. He never married, had no children, nobody to give the empire to. So what all the generals, they all sat around and said, hey, we should all vote on who should be the leader, right? No. All the generals tried to claim the empire for themselves. So Alexander's death sparked a period of civil war between the major generals who were all under Alexander's command. It didn't last very long, 4, 5, 6 years of internal strife and war, as always. And then they finally kind of came to this solution of why tear ourselves apart? Let's just divide it up 4 ways. So they got split between his 4 generals, Antigonus, Cassander, Ptolemy, and Seleucus. So big names. You don't have to worry about these guys because they kind of, when it comes to biblical studies, because they kind of went back to run their empires and didn't have much impact. But Ptolemy and Seleucus are huge names because they got control of Egypt and the Middle East. So Seleucus took control of Syria, Mesopotamia, and Persia, and Ptolemy took control of Egypt. And so it's called, sometimes what you'll hear is the Ptolemaic Empire and the Seleucid Empire. So again, they split up the empire. So you can see here, this is Seleucus. He gets all of Asia Minor and Israel and all of this. Ptolemy gets Egypt down here. And then the other guys split up the western part of the empire. But Seleucus and Ptolemy didn't play nice with each other. And they were always battling between this land, Palestine. Because, and you may say, why is Palestine or Israel always in the news and always the problem? And historically, there's a big desert here, right? So if you need to get from Egypt over to Persia or to the east, you have to go up through here because you can't go across the desert back in those days. So you had to go up through Israel. So it was the crossroads. And so everybody, all the empires were always going back and forth. If they needed to conquer Egypt, they had to go through Israel. If you're in Egypt and you need to conquer or go to war with other countries, you have to go up through Israel. So that's what happened. They were under the Seleucids. They were the rulers for quite a while. Let me back up. So they were under control of the Ptolemies initially. And what that general did and his heirs is they kind of said, listen, we're going to implement Greeks, but it's kind of like you should come to the gym, come visit us at the gymnasium, come, hey, you can have your temple. We got our temple. Our temple's really nice and fancy, and yours is kind of all run down. You should come to our temple. So it was kind of they were pushing the culture, but it wasn't like you had to do it. It was just kind of like, if we just push it long enough, people will eventually like it and start coming to do our stuff. That was the Ptolemaic approach. But in 200, the Seleucids said enough of that, and they decided, and so Antiochus III, who we have coins, so archaeology, we have some coins of Antiochus III. He was the king of the ruler of the Seleucid Empire at the time. He goes to war with the Ptolemaic Empire. They win, and he gets control of Israel. So Israel changes hands from the Ptolemies to the Seleucids. And Antiochus and his son, Antiochus IV, they did not have the same. They were still about Hellenization, but it became a nice option to you have to do it. They forced the Jews to follow. They forced them, they outlawed the practice of circumcision. You can't circumcise your baby boys anymore. They broke into the temple and they went into the Holy of Holies and they sacrificed pigs on the altar to say, we're in charge. This is no longer a temple to whatever crazy god you have, it's a temple of Zeus, and you have to worship Zeus. So even the Greek-leaning Jews, because as always in any society, there's kind of the hardcore nationalists who say, oh, it needs to be the way it used to be, and then there were the more big picture Jews who were like, listen, the Greeks are here, they're in charge, we need to follow along and do what they, try to be peaceable with them. Why are we continuing to fight with these overlords who could destroy us anytime they want? But even those Greek-leaning Jews they're like, okay, you've gone too far. And we have what's known then as the Maccabean Revolt. Have anybody ever heard of Maccabean Revolt? Has anybody heard of first the Apocrypha in your Bible? If you've got in a Bible with an Apocrypha, those are some texts that used to be they're not officially in the Jewish Hebrew Bible, they're not officially in the Christian canon, but they're kind of considered texts, and there's several of them called 1st, 2nd, 3rd, and 4th Maccabees, and it tells the story of this Maccabean revolt. So they push back against the Greeks. They're like, enough of this. After the desecration of the temple, there was a priest named Matthias Hasmonean, and he went into his little village, destroyed the Greek altar, killed a couple of Seleucid army officers, and then, of course, brought the whole Greek army down on top of him. He went into hiding in the highlands. A year later, he died. I don't know if he died of just old age or if he died in battle, but his son, Judas, took over. And Judas was called Judas Maccabeus, which means, literally translated, Judas the Hammer. Now, I don't know if he was like an iron worker or something like that, and he used a hammer, or if it was like WWE wrestling. Gonna drop the hammer on you. Regardless, you pick which one you like the best. I like time to drop the hammer. I can see him with the big belt over his head. He took over the revolt, and in 2 short years, he had recaptured Jerusalem, and that is the reason that the Jews, even today, celebrate Hanukkah, is the recapture of the temple and the rededication to Yahweh after the sacrilege of the Greek Empire, who desecrated the temple. And then, 20 years later, around 140 BCE, so we're getting closer and closer to the time of Jesus, the Hasmoneans had driven out the Greeks, and they entered into about 80 years where, again, Israel ruled themselves. The Greeks were gone, the Persians were gone, the Babylonians were gone, and it was just them. And so Israelites started saying, this is the time. This Hasmonean dynasty, this is God rebuilding Israel again. The problem was the Hasmoneans were not from the line of David. They were from a different tribe. And so they couldn't have the Israelites were like, well, this is great, but it's not perfect. We need a king from the line of David to be able to rule over us. Maybe we should, but maybe this is a good first step. At least we have control of our own destiny. So you started getting this kind of thought. It was a tantalizing hope for them. It was a period that also gave birth to an important theological concept called apocalypticism. And apocalyptic theology is this idea that there's a cosmic battle going on in the universe between good versus evil. The forces of good, the forces of God are at battle with the forces of evil. And what's happening here on earth, the battles between all these empires coming in and destroying Israel and exiling us and then desecrating our temple, these are all just kind of mirror images of what's going on elsewhere in the universe. And that pretty soon, not too long, God's going to come in, intervene in human affairs, and set everything right. Everything's going to be made right, and that day is not far off. It's coming soon, so be ready. Sound familiar to New Testament texts that you've read? That idea started building during this Hasmonean dynasty period. This little window after hundreds of years of empire, a little window of independence. But people will be people, boys will be boys, and pretty soon the Hasmoneans started arguing about who was going to control. The king died, and there were two sons, and they couldn't decide who was going to control the empire and become the son. And so this is where you have started to build now these two Jewish sects, one being the Pharisees. The Pharisees? They were kind of the more traditional, follow the law, teacher type rabbis. That's where the rabbis came from. They supported one heir. And the Sadducees, you've heard the Sadducees, they were another sect. They were mostly more elite, noble-born. They were also much more aligned with the foreign powers, so they would be more aligned with the Persians or the Greeks. And later, the Romans, they were kind of like, listen, we can't have all of this, silliness. We need to be able to, one is a more nationalistic view of the world. The other is, listen, we all have to play into these global politics. And so we can't, sometimes we have to do things that may not be in our best interest, but it keeps us going, within the entire world order, which that sounds familiar too. I hear a lot of that these days. After a while, though, so they started fighting with each other. They couldn't agree as to who was going to take over. And this caught the attention of the Roman Republic. The Roman Republic, in the meantime, had been growing. They had been defeating the Seleucids and the Ptolemies and other, battling with them. And they had edged their empire up to the edge of Israel. And so they were like, this could destabilize all the big picture stuff we're working for. So they sent their general, Pompey, into the Mediterranean, into the Civil War, and Rome now took over all of Palestine. So this is a map of the Roman Empire. So again, you see, we talked about the whole world, Spain, France, kind of Western Europe. The map keeps getting bigger, right? Before it was kind of Greece over to Persia. Now with the Romans, you've expanded the map, all of Northern Africa, the whole Mediterranean. So their empire, and around the time of Julius Caesar, this is about 45 BCE, this was the extent of the Roman Empire. It continued to grow and get bigger, but they had control pretty much of most of the world. So here's North Africa, Here's the Nile Delta. The Ptolemaites still controlled this part of North Africa, but now Rome had this important crossroads right here to be able to move troops down. If they needed to come in, they could move troops by land, and they could move them by sea. So they were kind of pinning in their global war against the Ptolemaites who were in Egypt. And so in 44 BCE, Julius Caesar gets assassinated. We've all seen the play, Et tu, Brute. He gets stabbed in the Roman Senate because he was aspiring to become an emperor and kind of take over. He had very empirical ideas, empire ideas. And Rome at that time was kind of a republic. They had a Senate and they voted on stuff, not quite a democracy, but kind of moving in that area. The death of Julius Caesar sparked a 20-year civil war between Mark Antony. You probably heard of Mark Antony. He was Caesar's right-hand guy, advisor. Octavian, who was Caesar's adopted son, and Lepidus, who was his main general, Caesar's main general. So, and at this time, Caesar means Julius Caesar, right? There's only one Caesar at that point, and it's just Julius Caesar. It's kind of his last name. So they go to war, and for 20 years they're battling around. But in 31 BCE, Octavian finally defeats both Lepidus, and then he corners Mark Antony, who at that point had made an alliance with Cleopatra, the Egyptian queen. She was also heir to the Ptolemaic Empire, so she was kind of Egyptian/Greek, but she and Mark Antony had kind of banded together, but they ended up losing to Octavian, and the civil war that had plagued Rome for 20 years finally ended, and the Roman Senate, and what happened was they basically disbanded the Roman Republic, and they created the Roman Empire. Because Octavian was crowned as the first emperor, and his empire name was Augustus. And the word Caesar became the title. So everybody after Augustus was Caesar, which was the emperor name, and then whatever your name was. And Augustus is Greek for great, right? So he was claimed Augustus, and he was proclaimed as the Son of God. Sound familiar? The Savior of the world. Sound familiar? So these are all the terminologies. The Roman Republic had been rife with conflict and strife, and then for 20 years, the Civil War, and Augustus came and put an end to it all, and brought in what's called the Pax Romana, or the Roman peace. And so from this point on, things in the Roman Empire actually get pretty stable. You can't cross Rome because they have a firm military control over everything, and they rule with an iron fist. But as long as you don't get cross-threaded with the Romans, life is good. You can travel around, you can move around the empire. And here's a coin of Augustus, Divi, Pater, the divine father, or the divine chosen ones. Other coins say Divi Filia, the Son of God. So it created this whole Roman Empire, created this ability for peaceful travel throughout the empire, peaceful communication, and set the stage for the spread of Christianity. If it had not been for this Roman peace that gets established, the ability for Paul and other missionaries to go move all around through the empire gets diminished significantly. All right, almost done. Have a good week. In 34 BCE, the Romans decide they don't have time to rule Israel on their own, so they set up what's called a client kingdom or a vassal king, and that is King Herod the Great. And if you have read Christmas is not that far away in the past, so I'm sure you've heard of Herod the Great. He was responsible for, he and his family had very close ties to Julius Caesar. So Octavian, now Caesar Augustus, liked them a lot. Gave him control of Israel. He ruled for nearly 30 years. He was also a Bob the Builder. He built lots and lots of things. He renovated and upgraded the temple. He created the Roman city Caesarea Maritima, right on the coast, which is where the seat of Roman government was for the Middle East sat, and that's where Pontius Pilate. If you remember the Lenten stories, we'll talk more about this in a week or two. He would come to Jerusalem to kind of keep an eye on things, but he didn't like hanging around Jerusalem. He wanted to be in the Roman city, which was Caesarea, right on the coast. And if you've ever been or seen pictures of the western wall of the temple, or also known as the Wailing Wall, this is the only remaining piece of the temple that is left anymore that we can access. If there's other parts of the temple, they're buried under the Temple Mount, and the archaeologists can't get there. But this all dates back to Herod. This was constructed by Herod, this wall, which is pretty cool.
There's a tunnel alongside the western wall called the Hasmonean Tunnel. Was that built in the Hasmonean period? Labeled that?
I have heard that. I don't know. I'll have to look that up. I don't know if it was an old tunnel that they used during the Hasmonean dynasty. It may have been. I'll have to look and see. Yeah, but the wall itself was actually part of the Herodian expansion of the temple. And so Herod controlled most of what we consider Israel, Judea, Jerusalem, Bethlehem, Samaria, which was the seat of government for the northern Israel, 500 years earlier. The Galilee, the Sea of Galilee, all of this was controlled by Herod. And Herod was, by most accounts, except for the Bible, a good king. He kind of kept the peace and everybody seemed to be doing okay. The Bible doesn't care for Herod that much. But Herod dies in 4 BC, which throws the whole calendar off. And so if you wonder why, most scholars say Jesus was born 4 to 5 BCE, and it was the monk who set the calendar, who was the one who counted back to figure out when Jesus was born, because that's how the calendar, he made a mistake. And he got his numbers off, so Jesus was most likely born in 3, 4, 5 BCE. Anyway, Herod dies, and of course, what happens? His 2 sons say, "Oh, we can take care of this." So the country gets split up between his 2 sons, Herod Archelaus and Herod Antipas. Herod Antipas, if you remember the story of John the Baptist, and he gets beheaded, that's Herod Antipas, whose wife says, "I want the head of John the Baptist on a platter," and so he makes it happen. So Antipas shows up in several, or a few New Testament stories, gospel stories. He was a pretty effective ruler. He ruled until 39 CE, so after Jesus' execution. Archelaus, on the other hand, he had Judea. He was a hot mess. Nobody liked him. At the very beginning, there was a gathering in Passover, and people were concerned about Herod the Great dying, and Archelaus decided the best way to deal with that was to send in the troops and crush the quote-unquote riot that was occurring on Passover, and then he canceled Passover altogether. So he lost faith with the people very quickly. And by 6 CE, he got deposed by Rome, and Judea, instead of putting in a new client king, it became a Roman province ruled by a Roman governor. The Roman governor was not Pontius Pilate, but Pilate was 3 or 4 governors later. So And so here you can see this southern part of Israel is Israel, Jerusalem, Samaria. This was all Herod Archelaus. The Galilee area where Jesus is from, Nazareth, and most of his ministry in the Gospels takes place around the Sea of Galilee, was all controlled by Herod Antipas. So, and then this became the governor. So, fast. I don't expect you to remember all that, but if you do remember something, just the big picture, Babylonian exile, everybody gets hauled off. All the promises that God has made to Israel have been shattered. Then Cyrus comes along, and the Persian Empire sends them all back, and the Jewish people feel redeemed. They're back in their land. They're rebuilding their temple. Life is really good. Then comes the Hellenistic empires, the Greek empires, and all of a sudden, what seemed to be a really promising future starts getting, all of their culture, all of their tradition, all of their way of life starts getting diluted by this onslaught of Greek philosophy, Greek culture, Greek everything. It changed the language. No one spoke Hebrew or Aramaic anymore. Everyone started speaking Greek. The New Testament is completely written in Greek. So by the time of Jesus, Greek had become the base language that everybody spoke in. And then there was a little window of self-rule where the Israelites were able to kind of rule them, have a little say over where they went. But that only lasted for a short window before the Romans came and set up the Roman Empire, created the Roman peace that allowed more movement of people, travel, a little bit of law and order, as long as your law and order as long as you didn't cross the Romans by saying things like, "You're the Son of God. You're the Savior of the world," because those were titles for Caesar. And so if some Jewish dude claimed to be the Son of God and the Savior of the world, then that was, you were basically claiming to be the emperor, and that would put you cross-threaded with the empire. And we'll talk more about that in the next coming weeks for our Lenten study. We screwed up Christmas. We had to talk about all this bloody battles during Christmas, but Lent perfectly aligns with where we are today. Okay, thank you guys for hanging in there with me. Have a great week. We'll see you next week. And next week we're going to do a series of 3 different things kind of on the Easter story. We're going to talk about Caiaphas, the high priest at Jesus' trial, and what we know about the priestly order and that. Then we'll talk about Pontius Pilate and what we can know historically about Pilate. And surprisingly, there's a reasonable amount of information about him. And then we'll talk the week before Easter about the crucifixion and some of the historicity of that and what we can see from the various Bible stories. So,
How different I think what you told us is that the Persians basically rewrote much of the Old Testament?
the Jews they combined and edited. So most scholars would say they had a variety of documents that were kind of older traditions. And they took those older documents and they stitched it together and edited it together into what is called the Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible.
So how different is the Torah today from the one written in that time?
What we can tell is it's fairly similar. I don't want to say identical, but the oldest Hebrew copy we have of the Torah is the Dead Sea Scrolls, which are around the time of Jesus. And then we also have the Septuagint, which is the Greek translation of, and there's actually, and then you have what's considered the modern day base text, which comes from about 1,000 years later. So that's the Masoretic text. They all are There's differences, but they're not significant. So you can really see where things in this Persian period collated together. You don't have any real evidence of that prior to the return from exile, but during that post-exilic period, things seem to kind of all come together, and then it seemed to stay relatively stable after that, from the Old Testament perspective. We only have a few little windows to kind of peek in, so sometimes it's hard to see. But all right, thanks everybody.
Another excellent presentation.
I hope I didn't bore you too much with all the names and names and maps and everything. Good. Have a great week.